Alan Littler is gaming lawyer at Kalff Katz Franssen, and he's joining us to highlight the main provisions of the recently adopted decree. Alan, welcome.
Thank you. And I say it's not too long before 5, so I hope people aren't going to be placing bets before 5 o'clock, since we're not in the office today. So thank you, Willem, for providing us with the opportunity to speak once again on the upcoming advertising restrictions, which will kick into force on the 1st of July, which is something we touched upon in a webinar back in May, which some of you may have seen. I think various things have been said about these restrictions during the course of today's sessions, particularly this morning. So I think what I'm going to be doing mainly now is providing some detail, which will then hopefully form a basis for the discussions which will follow in the final sessions, or the sessions immediately after this one. But Willem, I was looking at the title for this particular segment of today, Thriving in the Post-Marketing iGaming Landscape, and I thought, isn't this a rather negative title for this session? Because yes, there will be no untargeted advertising after the 1st of July, but I do think there will be some targeted advertising, but maybe I should have passed that comment on before. And earlier today, we heard some interesting points being made, particularly from the Gambling Authority and from the Ministry, with regards to these restrictions. And I think it's good to hear that the call for guidance, which has come from the industry and also during the webinar, has landed within the walls of the authority. And it's also comforting to hear that the authority also has to find its way in these new and uncharted waters. But equally, perhaps to get back to a point which was made, I don't think that the operators, and by extension their third parties, are really leaning back, sitting back and waiting for the authority to come forward with every possible point of concern being clearly detailed and with detailed guidance. But I think it's more that the industry is waiting for a sense of direction as to the direction in which the authority is thinking on particular points. Understandably, the sector doesn't want to set course for one particular solution whilst the Gambling Authority has something else in mind. But on that note, it's also welcome, or should be welcome, that the authority has indicated that it will issue further guidance at some point and will not jump to enforcement measures straight away. So I think there's some comfort to be taken there. So as of the 1st of July, as we've said, there will be a prohibition on so-called untargeted advertising. So basically advertising to the general public in the sense that advertising for licensed remote gambling offers can only take place when certain categories of individuals can be filtered out, so that certain categories do not receive or see such advertising, which basically entails, as we all know, that advertising in public spaces will be prohibited as of the 1st of July. And then advertising for online advertising will only be permitted when 3 cumulative conditions are satisfied. And I will get back to these in a moment. And ultimately, the ban is designed to ensure that the particular categories of vulnerable persons are not recipients of advertising for online gambling, and these include those who have excluded themselves at the level of the operator, those who show signs of excessive participation, and young adults, those who are 18 to 24 years old, or basically 18 up until 24 years old. Interestingly, this does not include those who are included in crooks, because, as many will know, a crook's check can only be completed when an individual attempts to log in or create an account with an operator. So online advertising will still be permitted, but what is online? And the decree makes reference to particular forms of online environments or channels, if you like. So clearly websites are going to be included, and particularly affiliate websites will be very important. But other channels will be open too, assuming that the conditions can be met. So direct email, social media, digital radio, on-demand TV, and video sharing platforms. These can still be used. And according to the decree, the prohibition will also extend to the game of chance interface, so the post-login environment, but more on that a little later as well. And although the ban enters into force on the 1st of July, there are 2 transitional periods for sponsorship deals, or 2 categories of sponsorship deals, I should say. So as of the 1st of July 2024, the ban will apply to sponsorship agreements for non-sporting events. And A year after that, the 1st of July 2025, the ban will also apply to sponsorship agreements for sporting events. Yet these transitional periods will only apply for contracts concluded before the start of next month. So I hope that Willem has got his sponsors lined up for next year's conference. Furthermore, the decree also addresses a situation in which an operator has a license for a land-based offering, as well as a license for an online offering. And the operator must ensure that advertising for the land-based offering does not also constitute advertising for the remote, for the online. How this is going to pan out in practice will be an interesting one to see. And despite whatever guidance may emerge in the coming months and maybe years, it will also be interesting to see whether consumers can actually make the distinction between advertising for one operator's land-based operations and can distinguish that from the advertising online for the online offer. So as we said before, there are 3 cumulative conditions which must be satisfied. Firstly, every potential recipient of advertising, when coming into a contact with a particular channel online, must be given the opportunity to opt out of receiving such advertising. So basically, each individual will have to provide consent. Secondly, we then go back to the categories of persons who must be excluded from seeing advertising material. And this is regardless of whether they have given consent or not. And on this point, operators and third parties acting on their behalf must take the best available measures to exclude those who have not provided consent to see the advertising and those who belong to a vulnerable group of persons, and which includes those I mentioned before, but also those who are in the age range of 18 and up to 24 must also be excluded. Usefully, in its guidance to the operators, the Gambling Authority has described this as a sort of best efforts requirement. I mean, we can all imagine the challenges one would face when trying to exclude somebody who has demonstrated the potential or potentially excessive behavior, gambling excessive behavior, with one operator from seeing advertising on social media. I mean, the complexity of that would be immense, particularly in terms of sharing data between different parties. Unfortunately, even though many are unhappy with this decree, and understandably so, perhaps it offers a little glimpse of hope compared to the original draft decree, which was put out for consultation about a year or so ago. So the requirement to exclude young adults is no longer absolute, but operators do have to show that that no more than 5% of the viewers or the recipients of that advertising material were indeed in the age range of 18 to 24. And on this note, the decree establishes that operators must use the best available techniques to demonstrate that at least 95% of the recipients are 24 or older. Perhaps somewhat unfortunately, we should also note that this safety valve, the safety margin of 5%, does not apply to the other categories of persons who must be excluded from advertising. And operators must be able to demonstrate that the 95% threshold is reached from day one. And then also, so that's not something we should be thinking about in August of this year, but something that needs to be in place on the 1st of July. And that this 95% should also be monitored on a continuous basis. So our advice there would be to have your paperwork in order, because as the Gambling Authority has indicated, it can certainly ask for the evidence which you've collected. The decree also notes that the restrictions apply to advertising in the online game environment, as it's called in the decree. We understand that to be the post-login interface, and interestingly, the wording used by the Gambling Authority was slightly different, referring to the handspell interface. So it's going to be interesting to see how these things align in the time ahead. But just to go back to one of the more interesting points, or perhaps one of the points which have been discussed the most, and also touched upon this morning, what are those best available techniques for measuring the 95%? Within the decree, there's no actual description or list of parameters by which one can determine whether one technique is the best available. And indeed, what's best or best available today might not be the best available technique when we meet again in 2024. And of course, best available doesn't necessarily mean perfect and flawless in every way. And as we heard this morning, and as we can see in the decree itself refers to Google Analytics as one of the techniques for measuring whether the 95% threshold is met. But interestingly, the text doesn't go into any detail about how Google Analytics works, and nor does it say how it should be applied in practice. If we were to think about other techniques, then perhaps those techniques would completely strangle or cut off or suffocate the ability to advertise. And the aim of the decree is not to introduce a total, full prohibition on online advertising, but to allow targeted advertising. And today, as of today, and as of the 1st of July, there is no better technique that we're aware of than Google Analytics. And given that it's mentioned in the explanatory text of the decree, we can only reasonably assume that the ministry is fully aware of how Google Analytics works, and it didn't simply pluck the reference to it out of thin air. And I believe that the comments which were made this morning certainly support this position. And on a related note, it's also clear from René Janssen's speech that the authority is not going to go in with all guns blazing in terms of enforcement on day one. It was also clear from the speech that the authority needs to figure things out and figure how best to implement and enforce and supervise this decree. So clearly the dust also needs to settle within the authority's offices on this. And while some further insight from the authority on how they view these measures or view these requirements in the weeks ahead of July the 1st would be very welcome, I think basically the sector is going to have to manage with the information which it has today. And so this is clearly going to be a point which is going to be followed very closely in the coming months, and one which deserves close attention and analysis, and most importantly, and I'm aware that there are initiatives taking place at the moment, to take proactive steps and not wait to the last minute. So I think it's a case, no matter how uncomfortable the decree may be, of working with what there is and not lamenting about what there isn't or what's lacking. And whilst, and this is on a positive note again perhaps, or not perhaps, but definitely, whilst it's clear that the authority isn't going to take enforcement measures in the short term without issuing further guidance, I think given what's happened since the opening of the market, the rash of advertising activities in the first few months, that the sector as a whole should also stay tuned to public and political sentiment. And whilst the law is the law, of course it doesn't exist in a vacuum. And so what we don't want is to perhaps shoot ourselves in the foot and ignite further restrictive measures. So I think we have to do the best we have with what there is and see how this one evolves. So Willem, I believe I'm in the time, so...
Perfect in the time. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you. Hopefully...
But before you leave the stage, I'd like to see if there's a question or multiple questions that were answered in Slido by the audience. I think we have one on the screen. Coming up, Alan, do you think the KSA will immediately fine operators when afterwards the analysis shows the 95% rule wasn't fulfilled through a certain channel?
Good question. I think that would then depend upon, what was the documentation underpinning that 95% or the amount which was not 95%, and what would the authority be learning about how the process works and how Google Analytics works, or whatever the other chosen method is, perhaps in the months ahead. So I wouldn't want to jump to the conclusion that they would, certainly in light of what was said this morning.
Great. Alan, thank you very much for answering this question. Thank you very much for the presentation.
Okay, sir. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.